So I'm gonna go with disclaimers first. Disclaimers are necessary. So this is one evening. So I only rehearsed this for one evening. Whatever I could get in one evening. I am not a professional linguist, right? This is worth mentioning, and I don't aim to be one, nor do I aim to be perhaps a competent one either. So not a professional linguist. Also, this includes all its umbrellas. So I'm about to go into a topic that deals with terminology. All right, and the other disclaimer is this does deal with some of my personal experiences. And not necessarily a job-oriented experience. So not job-oriented, to some extent. So these are a little bit, I think this will cover most of the disclaimers. Now, the thing that prompts all of this is I guess we'll call it the verb or the predicate that was introduced in this unit. And the predicate or the verb is dekiru. So dekiru, right? Dekiru. And it was introduced here. And the prompt was that duo, so we'll say the duo filter, which they use translation as their method, or they aim to be translating. So duo filter for translation for dekiru is no. I know. Shite. Hold. I still don't know the word for hold, but okay. Shiteiru. All right. So they use dekiru through a filter and use to know something. And what did they know? They used it in the form of knowing a language. Okay. All right. So it translated to, oh, my sister knows Japanese. My older brother knows English or something. Okay. Fair enough. All right. And then this creates the obvious situation where Indy would say, whoa. I'm sorry, Indy. I know you're a really great sport about it, and I really love I really appreciate your presence here. You're gonna say, whoa, this is more like can do or able to do, and then 8 billion other things. Okay? All right? Okay? But it doesn't necessarily talk about the conceptual, no. And it doesn't deal with the conceptual of understanding. So, like all great anime, I'm kidding, this is hyperbolic, but like all great anime, this is going to be the first scene, and I'm not coming back to this scene until I do my digression. So let's take it back to the beginning, okay? We're not going to talk about this and how much I know about this in one evening, or maybe in several evenings. before this. So this is the cliffhanger, guys. This is the cliffhanger. You know, the first scene in episode 1 where you're like, oh, Maku was in the middle of the best part. Like, how do we know how this ends? It's like, all right, now flashback. Time to flashback to last evening. Okay? So we'll keep this on the back burner and we're gonna erase this now. Okay? So someone came by and said it's can do. All right. So how is this relevant to expressing something? So what I'm trying to do now is I want to express my goal for this digression, which is started. So for the next 2 hours is to express how I think about things. As in, a lot of times there's a miscommunication on why and how I learn things in general, not just Japanese, but in this case, Japanese. I want to express and give a better idea and then record this for myself personally, record this for myself to practice expressing this, because I do get the questions a lot and it deals with this expression of how I think and why and how I learn things in general, but in this case, Japanese. And it does go into the idea, the perspective, so to frame it to individuals who's interested in the field of linguistics, or maybe they're casually the hobby of linguistics. So let's just place it in hobby territory so that I don't get nailed and criticized and burned at the stake for suggesting that I'm a professional linguistic person. I'm not. Linguistics is barely a hobby to me as well. My passion, first and foremost, is evaluating how to learn things. However, in this case, I'm going to frame it in this because it's appropriate. And that is the duality, or not duality, but the nuances of nuances, bringing back another video, I suppose. Nuances of nuances of the idea between translation and interpretation. Yesterday, much like I was talking about transliteration and translation, the other day, which I kind of sort of used it inappropriately for my own personal interpretations, and I've already mentioned that I wasn't really using it appropriately for whatever other people are doing. I was personally trying to distinguish it. So here, yesterday, I also did this. I raised the question about translation and interpretation. And the context was the idea of capturing the essence of language versus focusing on the literal translation of language. And this comes up all the time because our adult brains love to frame things with literal things. So oftentimes I met Sweat, and in coincidence met another person who was emphasizing literal translation and its contrasts and their abilities and struggles with literal translation versus the essence of language. So for me, I was thinking, yeah, I get it. It's that same, it's the same bootstrap where a stranger comes up and say, oh yeah, there's no translation for this. Right? No translation for this. So the ideal case is remove. Do I know the word? I do. I think it looks familiar. Yes, I do. But you can't say anything about it yet. We're not at that part of anime. So I already... Yes, we're going to talk about that later. And I know what that kanji looks like, but I recognize it as the kana. So we'll go into that later. And I'll use English to explain all of these things. So yes, I hold on to that thought. I've already made a hint to that phrase. If you're talking about what I think you're talking about, unless it's not what I think. Are you talking about understanding and knowing? Like, but that phrase is understanding. If you're not, then never mind. I don't know what that word is. Hold on to that thought. It may or may not be relevant to this. You don't know? Okay, what does that word mean? I'll take a little break. I'll take a little break because I want to hold on to this thought. Because I'm in the middle of something that takes 2 hours. Like, feel free to talk about that. I may or may not respond to it. Okay. Oh, you don't know what I'm thinking? Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Maybe later. Maybe later. Hold on to that thought if you're still around. Okay, so stranger, right? The stranger comes up and say, no translation. So their goal is to remove their tether to English or whatever their native language is, right? In order to do the immersion and then learn the essence of the language while also learning the translation of the language. And I mentioned a comment where I'm more about the essence or more like the interpretation of the language. And I might be using this incorrectly at the time, right? In terms of the linguist's scape, interpreting something. However, then Sweat came in and we kind of group thinked a little about the idea that when we think about language and how you eventually gradually become integrated into a language, it's the idea that you feel the language, you become expressive in the language. And oftentimes that circumvents this feeling of no translation. The idea is translation verbatim is ultimately going to fail at some point, largely because there's a loss in translation, you know, that whole idiom. So oftentimes when people focus on the act of translating written things, actively translating written things, my thought to myself was, that's kind of neat, and I appreciate and respect all those individuals who go out of the way to take it up as a challenge to translate everything. While on my hand, Duolingo teaches you the sentence for this has no English translation or something. Oh, really? I look forward to that. I will be very ecstatic when I get that, right? Because here, now let's think about this for a moment. So this person was saying, oh, you know, my flashcards, I would use my Anki flashcards, right? My Anki flashcards, and I would only put in an image of an anime. It's Turnus. Anime, and not use any English words in my flashcards. And my thought was, if it works for you to compartmentalize your experience in your native language in order to become more well-versed in the loss in translation of Japanese, that's great. For me, I'm more in the essence of interpretation. So this will come into play as I do a really terrible cursory job of distinguishing between translation and interpretation. For me, I love tethering my English and every language I have to the current language I'm learning. So what I mean by that is I kind of did a diagram, like if A is English and B is Romaji and C is Kana and D is Kanji, right? I like to enter at any position along this and be able to bounce to any other position on the spot simultaneously. I'm in the idea that I want to preserve the interpretation capacity back and forth in any of the stages. So, and this also goes into something I'm not going to cover today, which is the top-down approach versus the bottom-up approach, which was mentioned as well in this context. But it's a mix of all of them, what I'm about to talk about. So what is the essence of translation and the essence of interpretation versus literal translation, right? I was thinking to myself, maybe the linguist is going, like professional linguist is going to beat me over the head, and professional interpreters and translators are going to beat me over the head, and they will. So, sumimasen in advance, okay? Sorry in advance. I don't have a lifetime to become both a professional translator and interpreter. And actually, the common statement is that it's actually incredibly difficult to be both an effective translator and an interpreter, because they have a lot of mutually nuanced, distinguished skills. And what are those? For example, so let's do some stereotypes. This is very cursory and anecdotal. I want to highlight the things that are relevant to my narrative, and if I don't mention certain things, it doesn't mean those things don't exist. It's not for the purpose of this. So, translation often has a bias towards written, and interpretation has a bias towards speaking. Okay? I'm going more towards interpretation and translation. Yeah, Indy. You just took my punchline. Thanks, Indy. All right, time to wrap it up. I'm quitting. Indy just stole my punchline. I'm kidding. So let's think of this as a continuum. So a number line, right? So you have these slight subtleties, but there's a duality between translation and interpretation. One is a bias towards written, and one is a bias towards speaking. They're not exactly opposite, but they are not necessarily mutually inclusive of each other. Okay, so I want to highlight that. That's usually the common one. Now, translation has a stronger bias towards accuracy, and the sources that I used didn't use this word that I would say for interpretation, but the contrast to accuracy would be conciseness. So it's not exactly encompassing, but the idea is when you're interpreting something, you're trying to be concise as opposed to accurate. Sometimes being concise does sacrifice some accuracy, per se, okay? Oftentimes when you do one-to-one translations, they become unwieldy, nuanced, and verbose. So that happens a lot. It becomes very nitty-gritty, super, as most people would say, when they think about nerd language, right? Like nerd of language learning, oftentimes they're referring to the characteristic of accuracy that deals with translation versus the conciseness of interpretation. And I am a nerd for interpreting things as opposed to translating things. So I want to express that this very big difference that comes up in every week. There's at least 2 or 3 huge 4-hour sessions dealing with this exact distinction. Okay, so and then there's one last thing that I want to highlight between translation and interpretation, and that is the essence of time and feelings versus this time, so more like all time and limited time. And then feelings, I would say it's more like detached versus compassionate. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you're detached in translation, you can either be right or wrong, or more right or more wrong, right? So you're either right or wrong, or how accurate it's very measurable, right? You have a lot of time, things are written, you're translating it. So you can argue to ad nauseum whether you're closer to the right answer or more wrong, right? Like who's more right and wrong. So this is the element that me and tons of strangers that I purely respect their goal of being a great translator. That's the detached feeling. Like this is the right way of translating this. End of story. And it often deals with indicative form. Translating is indicative by nature. Interpretation is subjunctive. To frame it into an English term. Yeah, it's limited time, as in when you speak and you're interpreting it, which is what I do as a streamer, by the way, right? When someone is typing something, they can choose when and how, in what manner, and in what contextual way to give me their text. I have to speak and interpret it on the spot with a limited amount of time. So most of my skills involve communication. An interpreter involves more in the skills involved in interpreting. So how do I remain articulate and yet ignorant of what this person is talking about? That's the idea. So you ask for clarification. There are a lot of sentences in which you use that creates a scope of active listening versus dictation. So rarely do interpreters, in my opinion, lack the skill of heavy communication skills. Translators can completely lack communication skills. Because you're either right or you're wrong. You're aiming for a specific translation. Interpreters have limited time and must be compassionate to the things you're interpreting. So the reason why I say this is because most of my life as a multilingual person, quote unquote, multilingual person, is in the field of speech, not in the field of written. I'm illiterate in Fujianese. I'm illiterate in Mandarin, Cantonese. I mean, I might as well be, the closest thing I have to translation is probably Spanish. And even then, I spend more time in interpreting. So when I walk to the office, I actually used this example yesterday to elevate what I mean by interpretation. I'm an interpreter. My first 18 years of life, I spent most of my time interpreting for my parents. It's not about the accuracy, the one-to-one, word for word. If you attempt to, like, you know, when you watch a multilingual video, right? Maybe I watch a lot of multilingual video in which the Japanese developer, right? The Japanese developer say one thing and an interpreter is saying it in English. And now it's gotten to the point where I'm more focused on the idea that did the interpreter capture the essence of the person who's speaking in a different language. And this involves a lot of different skills that also involves compassion. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about, did you capture the overall scope of the thing? So as an interpreter for my parents, oftentimes people talk in a manner that they complete whole ideas before they stop to allow me to interpret it to my parents. So oftentimes in an interpretive environment, you are trying to consume all of it until that person is ready for, they completed the idea, and then I interpret that idea and explain it to my parents. And then my parents would ask a bunch of questions. I would ask a bunch of questions back in the language, in Fujianese, and interpret all of that and give it back to the person who doesn't understand what my parents are saying. So an interpreter has not only need the capacity to digest a huge idea, it's incredibly contextualized to the point where you must be aware of what that person is feeling, the competency level, the dissonance between the two, right? Like, I'm not going to explain the technical jargon that's coming out of a doctor's mouth in a manner that's one-to-one, as in if you are translating the doctor's language, it won't be unintelligible to my parents, even if they had the command of the language in that way, right? Because this goes into the next thing that I spend most of my life doing. And what it is that I actually don't even do this in my professional life because it's actually interpretation. So what is this? Why do I like interpreting things? Right? And this is where we're leaving. This is where we're leaving the field of linguistics. Sort of. It's maybe a different field of linguistics. And that's interpreting to explain something. Now, when you think about it, you don't typically, in my opinion, most people, when they think of linguistics, they're talking about different languages, right? Different languages. Oftentimes, it's literal. You have Japanese, you have English. What does my experience and professional background have to do with interpretation? It sounds like I only use English in my life. And that is because I also act as an interpreter for science, the scientific language, and the lay speak. So it doesn't have to be a literal different language. You can actually, there's a translation approach and an interpretation approach to explaining specialized subsets of the same language. And in my professional background, I have been doing this my entire life as well. I spend most of my time as a upper educated, as in what I mean by upper educated is, for example, if I'm an upperclassman, as in upperclassman, colleague, I often focus on the idea of interpreting scientific concepts and not necessarily lay in the sense of like simple. Sorry, this is probably not the word I'm trying to say. How to uninformed. The uninformed speech. As in, okay, well, I'm a biologist and the person I'm talking to is a physicist. So I must have to be able to somehow interpret what I'm trying to demonstrate in my content to a person without using language that is unintelligible. And even within the scope of English or any language, in Japanese, something, when someone starts speaking in poetry in Japanese, they would have to convert and interpret that poem to someone who doesn't understand the poem, right? So interpretation is still exists in the microcosm of a language. And for me, when educators and teachers, what they're necessarily doing is oftentimes interpretation. When someone asks a teacher what this means, they're interpreting. They're attempting to interpret. And oftentimes, teachers fall into the pit of trying to translate it. And even within the same language. And when you translate it, it often comes off as, it's not one-to-one, but the idea is like when you have a difficult math problem, right? And then you choose to use more math to solve the math problem, right? Oh, here's the math, and here's the proof for the math. It's like, yeah, that's kind of like translating. You're taking a concept and you're using the concept that they're trying to understand to explain the same concept. So when you need to interpret things, what you're doing is not necessarily simplifying. And this is another thing that, to me, simplifying is what translators do far more to, I don't know, help beginners than finding clever ways of interpreting the complex thing without simplifying. So what am I doing here right now is that I am trying to discuss something I do simultaneously for the last 30 plus years, as far as I could form a conscious decision. Every time I learn something, I'm doing all of this. I'm looking for interpretations. I'm looking to somehow talk in a manner, disseminate a complex thing that's happening in my head. The bootstrapping and the way I organize thoughts without simplifying it. What I'm doing is I'm doing a reinterpretation of it so that it is digestible for anyone. And I challenge myself to do it. It doesn't mean I succeed all the time. The success is dependent on how that person understands me. Eventually, my only feedback, the big feedback that I get is when that person starts using language like I do, and they start predicting my behaviorisms. That's ultimately the true feedback that I'm getting if I'm interpreting my complex thing that's going on in my head accurately. And in some way, that is the greatest feeling of an interpreter, in my opinion. If my parents can answer and feel satisfied with what I'm telling them the doctor is saying, and then the doctor does it, and my parents' expectations are met, and my doctors and their doctors' expectations are met in the interpretation, then you've successfully interpreted something. When you focus on translation, you don't have the time and the luxury to do a one-to-one, this doctor said this. What is the word? Man, I don't know the word for colonoscopy. How do I interpret colonoscopy to my parents? Well, you interpret it. What do I say when I try to describe to my parents what a colonoscopy is? I would tell my parents in a not so subtle way, quite literally tell them that I think the doctor is going to shove a tube up your butt. It's not the exact phrasing I would say. I would say something like they want to look at your where food comes out, right? Near your butt. They want to make sure that there's nothing in it. And when the doctor only says, "Oh, we're going to use a colonoscopy to check something," to say all these technical words that I understand in English, I would not interpret that to my parents and make it sound incredibly technical, so that even if I could say it, it would be unintelligible to them. So you're doing two levels of interpretation my entire life. Not only do I need to reinterpret the context so that it accommodates an uninformed speech, I am also swapping languages at the same time. So I take the complex English, distill it, and reinterpret it in order for my parents to be inclined in understanding how bills work, taxation works, insurance works in the country. So I've done this so much that I love teaching. So by translation, I suppose, when I got into college or even in high school, I love tutoring other people. When someone asks, I don't understand what Avogadro's number is. Right? I don't know how to spell Avogadro's number. But Avogadro's number. I don't get it. What does that even mean? What is this really, really large word? Well, you have to interpret it to the person. Your focus is on interpreting. A translator would probably use something like, well, it says this many molecules, and they would write the number of molecules into this amount, 10 to the 23rd, roughly, of something, molecules, into this compound. That's the translation. It would be the literal meaning of Avogadro's number. Does that work? Sometimes it does. It does. However, you could interpret it. How would I interpret it? I would use a diagram. I would use space. I would use volume. So if you're thinking about like teaching, what is an effective teaching tool? Well, there are a lot of overlaps between being an effective interpreter and being an effective teacher. So a teacher is not aiming to be literal and capturing all the nuances as concisely, as accurately as possible. An effective teacher typically uses the skills to understand where is your unformed person at right now. It's constantly relevant to interpretation. Like when you're interpreting for people live, you have to be aware of who you are interpreting between, right? It's capturing the essence of the language. A developer doesn't sound like a technical developer when they're trying to communicate to a group of their fans. And of course, the plugin screwed up the thing. It's fine. It's fine. We'll rewrite some of these. So when you're doing interpretation, you are capturing the essence of the language. And how is that relevant to Japanese, right? It bleeds into teaching. I've taught most of my life. I love tutoring. I like explaining the colligative property of chemistry in the sense of an uninformed computer science major. Like a computer science major, you don't start throwing around thermodynamics, kinetics, and I don't know, the molecular bonds and like valence electrons and things like that, which would be more of a translational approach where you take your elements and you still slap them across the head and do a top-down approach. Interpreters have to deconstruct and build back up as quickly as possible. So when a doctor spends only 5 minutes and they explain something in 2 paragraphs, and then they say, okay, I'm done with my idea, now you can tell your parents. They quite literally says, okay, feel free to tell your parents. That's what an interpreter does. You take all of that, and how do you capture that meaning, their expression of concern, their expression of like, what did all the language choices and word choices portray? Did it sound like the doctor is worried, right? Did they use a lot of negative words? So there's a lot of interpretation that is lost in translation. And even the literal act of translating is lost. So when someone tells me that, oh yeah, the way Duolingo teaches doesn't give you competence in the essence of the Japanese language. Competence in the Japanese language, right? I absolutely 100% agree it does not. You have to talk to someone. You have to listen to other natural conversations. That's what the interpretation part comes in, right? However, what the assumption here is someone infers that I don't care about that. So oftentimes, this is where tons of critics and debates, the root of the debate comes here, because I don't have time to explain my background and my motivations a lot of times, and it's a disservice. And I'll probably spend it and say it again and again. It will probably slow me down on Duo, but that's fine. I like that. I want to say it here that it's hard for someone who is trying to evaluate a product that focuses on translation, which most people agree. Duo is a product that focuses on translation. Am I focused on translation? Well, when I'm using Duo, yes. I'm evaluating Duo on its capacity to translate. For those who stuck around long enough, maybe a week or 2 weeks, and watch me rant about things, I'm most of my time, I would say even greater than 50% of my time while I'm using Duolingo is having discussions. And those discussions are involved in the field of interpretation. I'm interpreting everything. How does that look? Oh, wait. So the developers, it starts with my words like say, oh, the devs look like, oh, I see what they're trying to do. They look like they're doing this. This is their attempt, at least, I think. That's an interesting design. I guess they're trying to draw a contrast between ane and onesan, right? I'm interpreting their design. So I still do interpretations, but for a different reason that is very apparent. And then most people focus on their translation. So a lot of times they even take translational approaches to learning another language. They're like, oh yeah, I got to remind myself. This means literally can do. Oh, this means to know. And I get that. And for those people, it's a negative response. It's the one where, oh yeah, let's just forget. Like people would advise you, oh, just forget about everything. Don't try to learn Japanese in the context of English. You want to learn Japanese as Japanese. So either you take it literally so that you're closer to Japanese, or just forget there's no translation and immerse in Japanese. That's great. I think that's a very appropriate, reasonable approach. If getting reminded that you're trying to think of your English norms as a negative thing. I focus largely on interpretation. So, interpretation. So if someone can say like, oh, well, you know, there's no translation, right? There's no translation. What is the first thing I do? I try to offer an interpretation of that comment. A lot of times when you're talking about feelings, subtext, expression, how to express depression, mental like health, habit formation, you're often doing a lot of interpreting. So when someone tells you it's all right, and then I hear this person say a paragraph of negative things, only negative things, what am I doing? I'm interpreting what that fine means. It doesn't mean they're fine. If someone is language learning and the first thing they tell me is, oh, they love language learning and they like using their native language, and suddenly they're saying, oh, I'm learning Japanese and I am making sure I never think it in English. I'm never thinking about it in English. The interpretation is that this person thinks English, their native language, is a burden to acquiring a new language, so they remove it. What does that feel like? It's deconstructive. It's much like the advice when someone goes on the Reddit subreddit, and it's procced by a subreddit, by the way, because I was reading about the thing I'm about to go back to, the Japanese part. I was looking at the distinction between 3 different predicates that I already know, but Duolingo only introduced one of them so far. And that's dekiru. So when I was looking at the subreddit, someone would say, oh yeah, I don't get it. Like when someone said dekiru, I thought they mean to know, and then but it's really can do, but does it also mean how to if they're able to, or and then the full string of subreddits generally had the like feeling or advice that okay, you're trying to look for literal translation. Sometimes there just isn't a translation. You best not fight against your English tendencies and stop framing everything in the context of English. That would help this person because they're having a negative time. They're thinking that the lack of translation is frustrating them. In my opinion, as an interpreter, as someone who focuses on interpreter, that's a neat detail. Not only are the differences not negative, they are interesting. there is a lack. So it's affirmation. Like, oh yeah, you can't really express this. I need to know this. I need to remember this. Not pretend like it doesn't exist. So when you start immersing yourself and removing your English, the skill that you stop practicing is a skill that interpreters must have. And I love that. I prefer to have that skill over worrying about whether it's negative or positive or slows you down or speeds you up when you're thinking about English. I want this. I want to be able to interpret back and forth. If you translate, and this is the one last contrast between translating and interpreting, which I forgot to mention, is that oftentimes when you're a really epic goated translator, a professional is encouraged to only go one direction, unidirectional. And obviously, most of the stuff that I say is not. It's bidirectional. It's like multi-directional, actually. And an interpreter requires they go in multiple directions. And that's the difference between, some people might say, oh, but that's generalizing versus specializing. Well, translators must focus on translating everything as well as they can in their strongest language, right? They do both. In both cases, interpreters and translators aim to be really great at two languages, but their priorities are different. Translators focus on what is their strongest language, and they're encouraged to hyper realize how well it can be translated in their language. And that's the approach, in my opinion, of what most strangers come at me for. They're like, oh, wait, that actually mean can do, not no. And that, well, as an interpreter, my thought was the essence of this sentence is lost in translation. I would actually say this person is implying in this context, if I imagine it in my immersion stuff, like I go around, I hear a lot of anime things and anime scenes, and then I hear interviews and stuff. When they say dekiru in this context to an English speaker, the closest interpretation of it is that they know a language, not do a language. So it's not negative or positive. Those who focus on translation will say like, oh, you should stop doing that. You definitely should stop doing that because you're fighting against Japanese. Japanese isn't English. I understand that. That's from the translation literal point of view. As an interpreter, you need to answer these questions. These questions are essential to understanding what is lost and what is not lost in it. So knowing what is lost in translation is also beneficial to what isn't lost in translation. So when I go around and to help that guy, to help the person from a interpreter's point of view, I would tell them like, Japanese people have 3 different types of expression, and the expression you're looking for is shiru. You want to, if you're really concerned about learning something novel and something that you're acquiring at the moment, is shiru. And if you're wondering if you want a deeper meaning and form the idea necessary to understand the nuances and maybe already have the presence of that knowledge, use wateru. And then there's a nuance when you contradict and negate them. Wataru nai, or watana, what is it? Watana nai? When you negate it, you're actually telling the other person in a more polite way that you don't understand the material, versus saying shiranai, which is giving you the impression that, oh, I don't want to learn something new. Like, please, I don't care about learning something new right now. Like, not only do I not know, but I don't want to learn something new, right? So that can come off as rude. So these are the interpretations of those phrases. They're not the literal translation of those things. When you think about politeness, contextual rudeness, that stuff still is involved in interpretation. So in order to give this person more context, you don't, in my opinion, I wouldn't offer a translational approach where like, oh, there's no translation. Stop focusing on things that don't exist. Like there's no existence for translating this. You just need to know. So stop thinking about it in English. As an interpreter, you continue to try to not literally do it, but capture the essence of what it is. So dekiru, in the sense of a language, kind of means knowing. When you know something, you're kind of also inferring you can do it. And oftentimes do it is a smaller subset of knowing. So in English, in American English, which apparently American English is butchering, right? It's butchering English. When someone says, I can do something, yeah, I mean, there's no translation for a lot of things you already know. And oftentimes my conflict with that, Indy, is that I'm not looking for a translation. I'm looking for an interpretation. So oftentimes people find me incredibly pedantic and aggressive. Yeah. So like there's no translation for kimono and sushi. So what do? You interpret what a kimono is and you interpret what sushi is to the person who doesn't know what a kimono and a sushi is, or a yukata, right? That's the idea. And when someone asks you like, well, how do you interpret? And it works the other way around. So English, going from English to Japanese, when someone says bet, Indy, bet. Like, oh yeah, that slaps. What do? You don't translate it, you interpret it, in my opinion. How do you capture that slaps to a Japanese person? Like, these are the oral speaking patterns of language. So when you're speaking and someone's like, oh yeah, that slaps. And then you have like this Japanese friend that's looking to you is like, what does that mean? That slaps. Kono slap. Right? You would, if you're translating it, you would try to do the whole thing where you're like, okay, well, you start with, well, I know that it's kono. And then how do you say slap, but not literally slap? So how do you do the, so you're still, I'm not saying that translators don't interpret, right? I'm not saying translators don't interpret. I'm saying a lot of times you're on a continuum between interpretation and translation. And my encounter as a beginner Japanese person, like as a beginner learner, most of my conflicts of interest between people are that people are hyperly translative. The cluster of people are here, and I'm here, or not too much here, maybe here. I am closer to focusing on the purpose of interpretation as opposed to translation. Whenever someone shares this, I take it for fact. As in, what I mean is, I welcome people who translates things for me. Where the misunderstanding comes from is when people try to interpret what my goals are. So oftentimes they share with me lots of helpful things. It's super helpful. Like even this whole digression, this entire digression is an expression of interpretation and super helpful. I love this. And you know what? I'm gonna stop translating because I know there will be a stranger or someone who's willing to translate the Japanese for me. So it alleviates time. It saves me time when people translate for me. Saves me time. And what you're getting, in my opinion, if you want to stay here and hear me talk, you're getting an interpretation of everything. So a lot of times a translator would say, okay, I know the right answer, right? I know the right answer. And then a translator looks at me and say, you're in too deep, man. This is too deep. Like too deep. Too deep. Reel it back. I'm not being serious. Well, that's, in my opinion, that's what interpreters do. Interpreters focus. Have I used a training? Yes, every single day. I've used the training part of the kanji. It actually got changed 2 days ago. 3 days ago, actually. Three days ago now. So Duolingo's kanji training portion actually got changed. And I'm still evaluating it. So I write kanji almost exclusively through the kanji training portion of Duolingo. It's one of my favorites. However, it changed 3 days ago. You went back to the Duolingo precisely because of this kanji part? Yeah. So before, the kanji was just writing the kanji over and over again with all the different voice samples, and then the Romaji translation and the meaning in English. Now, 3 days ago, they added more different prompts, and also the kanji sections were segregated. So you go to those specific units to learn those things. Now they've added all the ones that recur, all the kanji parts that recur, and it's cumulative now. So the farther down you go, the more of the kanji pool it brings up. Those are a bit of the differences. So anyways, just to give you an idea. And so the answer is yes, and I love it. I still like the changes. I haven't been able to see how efficacious it is since it's only been 3. For me, they don't appear. I'm still in section 1. Is that it? Yes. They do not appear yet. It appears in the very last section. So section 1 got restructured. Section 1, unit 5 is when the first kanji gets. You get Ich, Ni, San, Tanaka, Yamaguchi, and Nakayama. Those are your first kanji in section 1, unit 5. So it's at the very end of section 1. And then every single section will have at least 1 kanji and 2 or 3 recurring kanji at this point. Hope that helps. So let's talk about the Japanese part, right? We finally reached it. I'm not going to go any more into the difference between translating and interpreting, but let's go into the final digression, which is the Japanese concept. And okay, again, disclaimer, this is just an evening and some like hobby exploration, right? And that is the idea of dekiru, which was introduced here. So dekiru was introduced here. And shiru and wataru. Yeah, wataru. You use Bun Pro and other platforms a lot, but Duolingo seems like a good choice for acquiring vocabulary. I hope so, Sin. I hope so, Zin. And you know, continue to explore other tools as well, for sure. I like Duolingo for vocabulary acquisition. I think the kanji section is going to keep rapidly changing, but the kanji section is definitely a different take. It does like the back and forth and the leaping, and so you go from like English to kanji or English to kana to English, kana to kanji, sound of the kana to the written kanji sound. So they do a lot of that, and then throw in the writing as well. So writing input. So if you have a writing implement, you can also do some of that. It's all of them mixed, and it's entirely cumulative. Also, before I go too far and forget to mention this to you, Zin, I think this is also new, but it's a super thing. It's a super feature. However, you can still use this. So in this, I haven't seen this. Maybe it becomes available later. Zin, it might become available later. I don't know if this is part of the patch, but it's not comprehensive. It's still enough to provide associated memory. But if you go into practice, I don't know if you're on the smartphone, but I'm on the web thing, and you go to words. Yes, you can't do the exercises for the flashcard stuff. However, now there's a section. I haven't seen this section that when I started 45 days ago. However, you can hear the audio, the kana and or kanji. They usually put up the kanji when it occurs, and have the audio piece, and you can go over recent vocabulary that is introduced in your unit. Yeah, so I don't know if this is new. It wasn't here until 3 days ago. So the day when they swapped up the kanji thing, where they added other used words. So this is what the kanji section looks like. This is probably what you're going to see first. The first unit and the following units will have a bunch of kanji, and then they will tell you what new kanji comes up and what new uses for a repeating kanji. And they'll do a lot of back and forth. And when you click on it, it'll give you all the pronunciation and the stroke order of the kanji as review if you don't want to do an exercise. And you can do it at your leisure as much as you want. It's not really restricted or anything. So that's kind of the new factors. Do I have any idea of how many kanji? Well, in Duolingo, it is said that there are 1,350 kanji. Now, there's no guarantee that all the kanji will end up in this section. This is relatively new, and I've already encountered some kanji that isn't logged in this section. So you may have to manually capture the kanji that isn't logged. So far, almost 90% of it is captured up to where I am. I have not completed section 2 yet. Yeah, so there's at least 1,350. I don't know if that number is flexing up or down or something, but that's the official number. Yeah, so it's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's above average, I would say, when it comes to a product like this. So anyways, hope that helps. Then I look forward to hearing what you think about Duolingo in the future. I'm not a developer for Duolingo, nor am I like in contact with any Duo devs. It's just that they have made a lot of changes to this even while I was using it, and those changes are fantastic. So let's go back to the lesson here. The lesson was dekiru and shiru and wataru, right? Yeah. If it helps encourage you, type something, share what you learned today, or tomorrow, or the day after. I would love to hear your thoughts on things you learned from Duo. I probably have some comments about it because it hasn't been too long since I've done section 1. Feel free. You'll typically only hear me be encouraging. I'm more of a encourager person than a person who tells people what they should and should not do. So keep it up. Sounds great. So all right, so overnight in anime, I've often heard the phrase wata da nai. I think it's this, but it might be something else. I'm pretty sure it's anai, but watada nai. And then I heard shite iru a lot, which is actually knowing to do something, actually, because iru is in here too, or coming into being, like it's a te iru form. So let's not go into that nitty-gritty thing, but the reason why this is brought up and why I looked into it is that dekiru, okay, now we're going back to what started this all. And hello, Sweat. You just arrived in the interpretation part of my digression. So I'm sure you'll probably have things to say, which is nice. And I think Indy is still here. The Sweat is in the chat now, Indy, in case you're curious of the person I was talking about yesterday. I was having a lot of fun talking to them. So through yesterday's discussion, when dekiru is used in this unit, through the duo filter, So when it's placed through the Duo filter, it comes up as no, right? And oftentimes Duo is considered a translation based approach. We've established that, right? That the feeling is Duo use a translation based approach. There are times when Duo actually goes one step and interprets it. And this is subtext that is absent. So this interpreted subtext is absent, which means that it doesn't get explained why they would interpret it this way versus translating it this way. And there are other examples. Indy, you and I have already gone through our 3 or 4 hours discussion about adu, and idu, right? There are a few areas where Duolingo actually stops translating and went more with interpreting. And that's where it got really fun, because we talked about it for hours, as opposed to just accepting as a fact that, okay, well, there's no translation, or there is a translation, etc., what have you. So Dekiru in Dual Filter, it's about knowing a language. And when I think about it interpretively in terms of English, when you know something, there's a subset of things that you can do as well. When you can do something, it typically infers that you know how to do what you can do. So oftentimes, this was an interpretation. And when Duolingo gives the impression that it's a translation-based app, most of the time, the comment would be, this is not no, it means can do, right? So it's predicated on the assumption that Duolingo, and I agree, 90% of the time, Duolingo is using the translation approach. They're not there to do a form of interpretation. Like another example would be something like, from last unit, I want, or I like, no, I am going to sit a bit, right? This is the translation approach that Duo is almost memed for, as in, oh yeah, that's just a Duoism, like, I'm going to sit a bit. Usually the interpreter, in my opinion, as a person that would interpret something, I would probably, although it's close to translation, I would say, I'm going to sit for a bit. So when you go literal in translation, often it gravitates towards that. But even in this very subtlety, I was looking for the word for. I'm going to sit for a bit. I'm going to rest for a bit. But when you think about how ashta, right? Not ashta. Skoshi. How skoshi is used in that context. Yeah, you can definitely go heavy on the translation. It still expresses the same thing when it comes to the interpretation. So I'm okay with that. These are the little stuff. These are little stuff that flies by, like, okay, that's fine. But then occasionally, from time to time, I would say 2 or 3 times so far up to this section, things like aru and iru becomes heavily interpreted. And when it becomes heavily interpreted, it triggers the translation red flag, where you say, wait, where's my grammar point? Or that's not what it literally says, right? And it came up yesterday in a very useful way, and that's what triggered this entire digression. So yes, they did say it does mean can do. However, when they translated it, like when you're looking for the right answer, they're looking for an interpretation of it. So you know a language as opposed to you can do a language. And then the translator would say, or a person who focuses on translating would say, well, Japanese people think it's perfectly normal. And like, I assume it's perfectly normal for a Japanese person. As an interpreter, you have to understand Japanese to English and English to Japanese. The goal is that when you take English to Japanese, you accept, like, this is what Japanese people know. Like, you're acquiring Japanese. So the idea is like, oh, this must be normal for them to phrase it in this way. However, when you're doing Japanese to English, you're interpreting the other direction. So when someone says, dekiru, I don't know, like, I'm not as good right now, but say like, Nihongo dekimasu, right? Nihongo ga dekimasu. It would say, I can do Japanese, right? When you're going the other way, a Japanese person would be saying, Nihongo ga dekimasu. It might be something else, or o dekimasu, maybe. Whatever it is, the idea is this person is going to then talk to me, and I'm like, I'm not a Japanese, I don't know enough about the Japanese language, but at least in this case, if I were to take an interpretive approach, it would be, oh yeah, this person knows Japanese. If I'm talking to the English person, like, this person is saying they know Japanese, not they can do Japanese. So it's not negative or positive. It depends on which direction you're going. So when that forum, all the subreddits, when someone asks, I don't get it, why when I try to say Japanese and I use dekiru, that other person says, oh, the Japanese person say like, oh, you use this instead of this. They're going from Japanese, English to Japanese. But then when they're asking the subreddit, they're going from Japanese to English. And most of the people who translate stuff goes from English to Japanese a lot of times in terms of their logic. As in, oh yeah, there's no translation for this because I'm a translator. Like, it's implied, I'm a translator for a very long time. There's no translation for this. You just got to know, stop thinking about it in the context of English. It's like, pretend you're not an English speaker anymore. Just constantly think of it in Japanese terms. That will definitely help you acquire the Japanese mannerisms and interpretation. It does not help an interpreter to pretend like it's not important. The goal of that guy is to learn Japanese. So they're not trying to be an interpreter. For me, most of my life, I'm interested in interpreting because interpretation helps me teach things and explain things. It's not to always say, I'm an English person, try to learn Japanese. In the same simultaneous time when I'm learning something new in Japanese, I'm thinking about how that Japanese person is going to express it in English. Much like everything I've learned in my life is an interpretation, but that summarizes everything. As a teacher, I'm interpreting complex scientific principles and I'm teaching it to people who are uninformed in the language of scientific concepts. When you're trying to explain a valence electron in a compound, do you start with using the word electrons and valence? You don't. You interpret it so that it can be understood in a different way. Not literally translate, hey, oh, electrons are these subatomic particles and these subatomic particles. No. So oftentimes when someone is providing me advice, I hope to be competent enough to understand it as opposed to the other way around. But to me, that's an interpreter talking to a translator. A translator will tell you as accurately, precisely, and esoterically as possible. And that is my experience so far. 99% of the time, outside of Sweat, I don't know if Sweat's still here. Yesterday when we were talking about like essences, expression, emotional capture, that's the essence that I'm trying to resonate or express in terms of my goals of learning. My goals of learning is generally from an interpretive perspective, not a translational perspective. where, oh yeah, you just gotta memorize these. You gotta memorize this can do. It's like, okay, yes, I understand that. It is what it is closest to. But when I try to teach something, or when I'm trying to educate to myself and I'm interpreting for my parents, it falls short, because interpretation is often all the things I juxtaposed. It's oral, it's limited in time, it requires compassion and competence, and it requires synthesis of large bodies of expression, behaviorism, and then reinterpret it. So oftentimes, Duo doesn't give me this feeling. Duo is legitimately, and I agree with most people, Duo is using one of the most, I would say, utilized, but as well as old, archaic types of learning, which is the bottom up approach. So you're like building up a kid kind of thing, bottom up approach, and it focuses on translation based methods, as in Duo will give you the impression that it's most appropriate to be literal with your translation, and then it fails exactly when it requires interpretation, because it does not focus on that. It doesn't provide explainers for why they suddenly shift to interpreting the thing. So Dekiru is being interpreted as knowing a language. It is not being translated as knowing a language. If it was being translated, usually I would agree with most people and say it's about they can do Japanese. And when you can do something, interpret it to an English person, it also means you know how to do the language. So you know the language, and therefore you can speak the language. And can speak is a literal translation for something else in Japanese. There is I was given hanashimasu, right? So there's talk and speak. So yes, there's going to be redundancies in interpretation, and interpretation oftentimes requires an art form, right? It feels more like an art than a science, oftentimes, because interpretation must require the competency in real time with limited time of expressing. And as a content creator or as a live streamer, I am interpreting everything you're reading, like everything I'm reading. So when you're writing out your texts, you're looking up your grammar, you're making sure you don't say anything wrong. I love it when people type too fast and they make errors in their text, because that is the closest thing to interpreting than it is to sit there, formulate your responses, and then type them out to make sure that you're never wrong, right? That's a translational approach. And for me, even now, when I'm using Duolingo, when I read people's messages, I'm interpreting people's messages. So oftentimes that is the distinction between the skill that I'm constantly using versus the skill I'm not using. I am very underpracticed in literal translation, and it feels kind of weird sometimes and rigid in literal translation. What does that mean? It means I suck at Duolingo. Duolingo is fun to me, not because I'm fast at Duolingo. Duolingo forces me to do something that I don't do very often. And then it forces other people to inform me on using a skill I rarely use too often. And I'm learning so much about the way I don't learn anymore by using Duolingo. So the purpose of here is I'm beginning to understand what it's like to be a kid again. And yesterday, someone triggered me again, which happens a lot. Or like trigger, when I mean trigger, I don't mean by angry. It triggered more thoughts. Is the person that said the kiddie pool. And this whole like stereotype about projecting Duo as a kiddie thing, I agree with you. I actually agree with you, but not in a bad or not in a negative or positive sense. This is the time-tested children-proof approach to learning something. And I haven't done this in so long. So whenever someone gives me advice like, oh yeah, this means can do, it's like, oh yeah, got it. Got it. I'll have to try to remember that. And then the next day, over time, if I use dekiru a lot, it will become flexible between how to explain someone that it literally translates to can do versus it's interpreted as no language. Much like aru and iru is interpreted as have if they have lots of contextual clues that talk about possession. Not the literal possession of aru and iru. Aru and iru does not express possession, but it can infer to have possession to an English person when you have contextual clues that reinforces the idea that it exists in someone's possession or in something that it's belonging to that someone. So I think there might be 3 or 4 other places where Duolingo kind of went a little loose and ran rogue with their translation and went to interpretation. Oh, like the idea of prepositional phrases as forms of time. So like, for example, on Saturday, I often swim versus I often swim on Saturdays. Now this is the other way around. So oftentimes, I would say from an English perspective, going to Japanese, that is going to be a little bit tough. And then from Japanese going to English, I don't know enough. So I can't even say interpretively how on Saturday, because the structure is the same. So like what I mean is I'm inferring that if the sentence is structured this way, it can be interpreted 2 different ways in English. So for Japanese people, that might be the way, that one way to express that. In English, when I see it, I have to interpret to that person, wait a minute, okay, so if that Japanese person talked about how they have lack of time and they're making sure to make time for something, okay, I'm going to tell this person that they're saying on Saturday, they often make time to swim. That is an interpretation because there's a hyper focus or hyper exposure to time. So to express and interpret the feelings of what the Japanese person is doing that is nuanced in English is that on Saturday comes first. It becomes very important. It is elevated so that the rest occurs on Saturday. Things like that. And it might not be accurate, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to be as accurate as possible, much like translation. But interpretation is just that. It's often less precise because it deals with compassionism and other things. And that's kind of the whole yesterday's remark. So what can I say about this, the Japanese part? Sorry, now we're going back to the climax where I started, the Japanese part. So overnight, I did a little cursory look. So I love some nuances that I want to point out about dekiru. So dekiru, when in the context of a thing, yeah, you're talking about if you're able to do it. It's great. It's awesome. It's a very useful phrase. And I've actually seen it a bunch of times from strangers that share the thing, dekiru, because I remember that weird, like, this kanji. I don't know how to draw this kanji yet or like write this kanji yet, but it kind of looks like this. It kind of looks like this kanji. So I know people have used dekiru a couple times already. So, and they used it in different contexts, but it's about being able to do something, right? But a lot of times that expression is also mean, do you know this already? Or have you done this already? As in inferring that you've known this already or have experienced it already. So that's the interpretation. And then I already know shiteiru because of anime and stuff. And shiru is to know, as in to more so learn something. It's the word that I would use often or would like to use, not introduced in Duo yet, but it's about the openness of acquiring a new information, the essence of it, as well as to know something. So when you say shite, like if someone tells you something and I would use shiteiru, I already know it, or I'm in the process of, I currently in the state of knowing what you said. It's acknowledging that thank you for your advice. The essence is thank you for your advice, and I also know it. Isn't that great? Isn't that nice? Ski desu ne, right? And then wataru is about the state of I already know this. Stop being pedantic when you say it in like the present tense. So it can come off as a little bit rude, like, okay, stop telling me what I already know. The essence, right? Stop telling me what I already know. However, when you flip it, when you're negating this feeling, it's the opposite. So when you say wataranai, like wataranai, you're saying, oh wait, I don't understand that. Sorry, like maybe you can welcome the person, like, can you further explain it, like to elaborate? And I would use wataranai as a way to express, oh, can you elaborate? Because I'm a little confused. I don't understand. Like maybe you can explain it more to me, right? And then if you say shiranai, you're actually saying, I'm not open to learning anything new, bugger off. Because I'm not open-minded right now. So I'm not ready to receive any new information. And that can come off as rude, right? And you hear, I heard shiranai a bunch of times in anime. And that's usually in an aggressive form, right? And then wataranai comes up too. So when we're talking about interpretive things, yes, this would be interpreting it. Do I know the literal translation when they're used in a sentence? I don't know yet. I actually have no idea. Since they weren't introduced in Duo, I'm trusting Duo to attempt to literally translate it for me. But for me, I already know the emotions and the interpretive contextual use of these words. I've heard these before in a context. And when I heard someone, when the first time I heard dekiru or dekimasu in terms of the language, I think it was you, Sweat. Maybe the other person said like, oh yeah, it means can do. And I'm like, I understand, it does. That's what, it might have been Turnus. That it's in Duo. It does say multiple things in Duo. However, yes, they're making a loose interpretation of knowing a language. That's pretty cool. These are the nuances that I want to talk about all the time, because now I remember dekiru with the association of shiru and wataru. So, or it might be wataru. I'll have to think about that for a moment. And much like aru, arimasu, when they brought it up, arimasu, and Indy talked about iru, well, in this case, it was introduced in this unit. Imasu. Imasu was introduced in this unit because of family members. So coincidentally, this ties back to all the other ones. I love that we get to discuss about these things. And it's not necessarily due to the failings of Duo. I think Duo's design has particular consistencies and visions that they have, and occasionally whenever they loose out of that consistency, in this case overstepping no by interpretively and using have as an interpretation of aru, it's fine. And then obviously there are a lot more other things on shiru and wataru that I won't go into, but it's super cool, and I hope we get to explore shiru and wataru when it comes up. I also feel that a lot of people end up learning a lot about the language but not necessarily internalizing the language. Yeah, they may be able to come up with a sentence or know the meaning, but they need to decompose the sentence and analyze the grammar, etc. Yeah, it's both. The answer is both, but oftentimes we're not looking at it in black and white. But yes, that would be the rebuttal, the counterpoint. But I'm not presenting the counterpoint at the moment because the counterpoint is overrepresented. The language needs to be internalized and happen automatically to be effective. I would imagine this transitions would be difficult without an approach that had at some point focus on internalizing the language. Yes. And to me, using an interpretive approach is putting forth internalizing the language, not working on the mechanics of the language. The reason why I'm saying this type of thing is not because I'm ignorant of the other perspective or the counter perspective. It's overrepresented to me. My experience and my digression for all of this is in contrast to it. So, Sweat, our discussions yesterday, as well as other discussions, all culminated in synthesizing and internalizing what is happening there. As in, I'm revealing or articulating my expressions and my motivations on how I'm interpreting information, taking in, and what my goals are expressing out. Because oftentimes, many of the first questions are, what are my goals? Well, my goals are to internalize. However, that's not the same, and I want to qualify, internalizing is bi-directional. For me, the feeling of internalizing is bi-directional or even multi-directional. I do not believe, in my opinion, that you truly internalize a language when you cannot bridge bi-directionality or multi-directionality. That includes going from Japanese to English, and then English back to Japanese. So when I truly internalize something is when I can see what things don't do and what they do. Not to reject what they don't do and embrace what they do. That's not internalizing a language to me. And what is overrepresented is often focusing on what one doesn't do versus embracing what one does do. So to contrast, I'm not inferring that this is, I'm not trying to infer this is what you're saying. However, when you internalize something, the route to internalizing Japanese for me is not embracing everything that Japanese does in isolation. It's all of the above. To internalize a language is to understand its juxtaposition to your current language, because that is part of you. So if you reject what you internalized previously, personally, I feel that's a dissonance. So you know what English do and English don'ts, and you also know what Japanese do and Japanese don'ts. That whole idea of Japanese does this and English don't do what Japanese does, right? That's half the picture. This is the major viewpoint that I'm exposed to. Japanese does this because I'm learning to quote unquote internalize Japanese. So you remove your native language. To understand Japanese, you must internalize Japanese, live in it, become it, right? And oftentimes this becomes a bias to tell you what English doesn't do for Japanese. And that's perfectly reasonable. That can probably accelerate your way to internalizing the language. I agree. So when you immerse in a language, you're not focused on what it doesn't do or doesn't get captured by English. Meanwhile, it also means that you don't know what English can do for Japanese and what Japanese don't do in isolation. So for me, as I'm learning, the answer is both. So while you have a counterpoint to my obviously bias bent, since you popped in the middle, right? My answer is both. Ultimately, when I feel like I've internalized a language, I understand what Japanese does and do and don't do, and I understand what English do and don't do with relation to each other, or any of the languages I have. That is when you internalize, in my opinion, because I don't live in a one language compartmentalization life. Like really don't. It's so difficult for me to get through one day internalizing one language. It doesn't happen. And every time I get on Duolingo and every time I'm watching YouTube, I do not see myself sitting in one language. I see myself sitting in all the languages I've acquired to this point. That is the true internalization status for my mindset. So when people tell me what English don't do, then I will probably tell them what it does do or could do. And if they say Japanese don't do this, I will try to see what Japanese could do in that regards. That is the true essence of understanding something, in my opinion. Is it an achievable, realistic goal that it can be acquired efficiently? The answer is no. Very no. While things like translation and interpretation requires nuance of different skills. Much like most skills, they are incredibly tough to master, let alone co-master both of them, right? Go around and ask if someone is an expert translator and have them evaluate if they're an expert interpreter and back and forth. For me, my goal is to strive to be motivated by unattainable goals. That's personally, unattainable goals. It doesn't make me feel bad that they're unattainable. I tend to strive for it. So if someone asks me to internalize a language, I probably don't even resonate with them. Like, I probably don't resonate because the person is probably talking about, oh, to internalize a language, you must live in the language and never think about a different language. For me, it's the opposite. To internalize a language, you know the ins and outs of a language while simultaneously also ins and outs of another language. And you know how to compare them, relate them, know where the loss of translation is, know where the translations are possible, and know where you could interpret back and forth. That is a true internalizing. I don't compartmentalize my language. It's a different type of perspective. I'm going to be much, much slower than someone who wants to compartmentalize and internalize in isolation. Perfectly fine. I don't think that is necessarily the argument that you shouldn't bring in your negative language, okay, but rather that you need massive exposure to get things like the sound system. I'm not arguing for a point. I'm sharing my goal. In the beginning, you would struggle with even perceiving the sound. You would need be too exposed. Yeah, the answer is both. I'm not arguing any points. Then you finish before that you are done. That you finish a sentence before they are done in your head. That's fine. Do both. Do all of them. So if you have more counterpoints, I agree with you. Probably. Because I feel like we have the same resonance when it comes to being inclusive as opposed to being exclusive. So oftentimes you're constantly challenging my inclusion, and I say both. I agree with you. You will probably begin with struggling in perceiving the sound if you're not exposed to it. Dropping English doesn't necessarily lead to a lower exposure for a beginner. Sometimes embracing English allows one to gain more exposure to Japanese because of behavioralism. So while we're being inclusive, we can think of all the hypothetical situations in which one has a myriad of approaches in order to internalize a language. And I'm sure we can go back and forth for like 3 or 4 hours to find all the different pre-selection conditions and various, exceptions and whatnot when it comes to how to acquire or internalize a language. So I agree with you. I think that's a very valid point that some things require massive exposure to get things like sound effects. So if you want to internalize a language, if interference from a native language or not interference from a native language. You have to determine that for yourself and then use that to increase the exposure to a language in order to get used to the sound system. And one of the sound systems that we were talking about yesterday, right, was the ah, the and the ah. And I've increased my frequency, of the exposure to the and the ah. And I can wholeheartedly and confidently tell you that I will probably embrace my Englishisms and find out where I would do the and I might be able to at least express and internalize why that is the case, right? And then perhaps one day I can go back and forth consciously between the two. I do say Australia, not Australia, okay? And I do say America and not America sometimes. However, when I say America, that is Japanese. And I'm more comfortable in saying America than America, like America. So I won't say America, I will say America. So things like that. It came up yesterday and it's brilliant. I love it. I didn't even notice it. So when you internalize something, sometimes you don't even notice it anymore. And that's pretty sweet, right? And you get this because English is relevant here to Japanese. You don't get it if you ignore that English doesn't exist. So when someone says and we wouldn't have a discussion about it. It would be, you should say this sounds normal. You can't learn anything else but this. So because of that, you lose more competency, in my opinion. You give up competency in the language you used before. Instead, it's an enriching point now. I understand more about Japanese because someone noticed that I use and So my appreciation and internalization of Japanese went up. So when I'm saying things like I still can't say Australia in Japanese very well. So otoreria. Otoraria, right? Otoraria. I'm being more open now with So So it's not necessarily because I focused on one sound. Now because of English having and I can internalize what a closed and an open is, and it allows me to internalize the Japanese language more. So perhaps not. Just an interesting counterpoint, and that inspired me for this as well. Not just dekiru, shiru, and wataru, but the and thing was really cool too. It allows me a lot of fun things I can do. And yesterday I was messing around, right? Like saying ane, I like ane versus ane. And it might be taken, all this experience will also move forward into Mandarin, into Spanish, and so on and so forth. It's pretty sweet, in my opinion. If it doesn't help you to do this, then don't do it. These are expressions of my own opinions and things that help me internalize language. I'm not prescribing life hacks, right? I'm not prescribing life hacks. I'm not prescribing that you should or should not do things. This is a digression that I'm anecdotally trying to express of my own. So I probably agree with whatever your approaches are, naturally, because they are your approaches. I would like to emphasize sound knowing the sounds early on. It is, in my opinion, like a force multiplier. Interesting. Every time you hear something, you would map it to the sounds you have internalized, making the words significantly easier to remember. Agreed. Personally, I did internalize the sound in the beginning by just listening a lot of Japanese. So did I, for sure. And when I went back to looking at new words, I felt like I could remember them easier. I love that. And I want to add to it. So when I'm using Duolingo, I'm always speaking. Even to this day, I'm always speaking. I'm always writing. I'm also using imagery techniques in my head. I'm also producing sentimentalism by having discussions. Because I stream, right? Because I stream. And all this is within me. And now I have outside sources, which are people like you, Sweat, right? People like you. So they are also adding to all of this. So there are many, when it comes to remembering, if you're talking about remembering, I agree with your speech. I would like to add writing to it, imagery, sentimentalism through streaming. So I choose to stream myself using Duolingo to learn something. And Duolingo is using a memory technique that I don't typically use. And then most people are introducing information about the techniques that I typically use to reinforce those techniques. And then having discussions about it is only made possible interpersonally. So what is my current retention of Japanese vocabulary? It's incredibly high. And it's attached to those things. Even usage rules are incredibly high retention. What does this mean though? It also means on the surface, it may look slow. So when someone teases apart and hyper focuses on one of these components, right? Like if you're hyper focused on reading comprehension, which is a place that a lot of strangers would say, oh yeah, I need to remember these words, I need to be able to see it and stuff, like, well, I'm juggling all these things. So ultimately, if you hyper focus on one goal, I'm obviously distributing my time in many things. Is it more efficient or less efficient? We'll find out. We'll find out in the long run. So right now at day 45, you take all the statistics around, I don't know who else, but I am ahead of the curve right now. Even though I feel like I've slowed down substantially because I'm not relying on speech, or I'm not relying on the stuff that I am typically doing. I tend to rely on novel things, and this is part of the learning process and not part of learning Japanese. So I'm exploring all the things I can do with learning Japanese. I'm not exploring all the things I can learn about Japanese. And my expression here and talking about the difference between translation, the motivations between taking a perspective on translation versus a perspective on interpretation is largely how I kind of granulate my emotions and my motivations. So I'm doing all of these things. And ultimately, if you focus on something that I'm not focusing on, which is all of this, then it would be slower. Objectively, in every possible way, if you are doing more tasks than what someone values, then ultimately it's less efficient, it's less valuable, and there will be a conflict of interest. So what you reveal to me, and I am really gracious, you reveal to me your priorities, which is often on sound and early on, and it acts as a force multiplier. And then I'm not suggesting you don't do any of these. I'm suggesting you have different priorities. My priority is still speech though, and listening. I actually am with you there. My crutch, the ones that I follow after, is writing and construction. Construction is what I would use the last phrase, which is usually creative process. So for example, like creating sentences, the thing that we strive to, some people strive as fluency, construction, right? I don't particularly think fluency is exclusive to construction. However, some people simplify it to the idea that when you're fluent, you can construct and create. For me, it's all of them. They're building blocks to each other, and they're integral to each other. So one can be incredibly, I've heard this a bunch of times where people compartmentalize their values and project their values, where like, oh yeah, I know a lot of people who are incredibly well read, but they can't speak at all. I'm like, well, both. The answer is both. Like, internalizing a language is both. So when you overvalue something, yeah, certainly you're going to diminish the achievements of someone else. I probably can still read English in a more detailed, comprehensive way than I can speak at the moment, right? However, it's both. It's a culmination of all that stuff. When someone comes in and projects a specific priority, I must respect that I can speak to them in that way. So when someone tells me, oh yeah, you're not constructing sentences, you must be underdeveloped. Agreed. I haven't been doing it yet. So therefore, it is underdeveloped. And then they would do the thing where they brush aside things like, oh, this is the most important, so you should be doing this. I'm like, then you're crossing the line. You are still crossing the line. So the idea between expressing what you feel is important versus gaslighting someone to telling them that is the most important thing to them are two different things. And that's often dealing with my digression regarding the indicative versus the subjunctive. I feel that in my ideal environment, I aim to achieve a state in which is more reflective of the interpretive approach of learning language. I'm not telling you that it is the ideal approach to learning. At least I hope I didn't give anyone the impression that whatever I said was, this is what you should do. I'm not selling life hacks, again. However, most people, when they express their thing in English, they use the indicative approach. This is more effective. This is more important. That kind of thing. And I read it as they're probably expressing their opinion, hopefully. At least I hope. And when I do that, usually some people slap me in the face and say, well, experts say this, not me. But because experts say it, I believe it. Right? That's the line of thought that happens more often. And for me, it's far more interesting when someone is using, I wrote subjective, but I meant to refer to the subjunctive. When you are expressing your opinions, what worked for you, what you feel is most important, that's incredibly informative, and I don't have to infer it anywhere. And that's why I feel that we resonate, immediately resonate yesterday, Sweat. You think sound is really important, since sound is the essence of what a language fundamentally is? Okay. Whether you are reading or writing, you still have an inner voice. Fair enough. You should still focus on all the other stuff though. I agree with you. I would also say the other way is true too. So, multi-directional. If I could add to your thing, this is me being a little bit more inclusive, maybe relatively speaking. So when you say you have an inner voice, you also have an inner vision, and you also have an inner logic. So when you see something, you'll have an inner voice. When you hear something, you'll have an inner vision. When you hear something, you'll also have an inner logic. So all of these are present simultaneously. Not that one, sometimes this might come first if you're focused on that. This might come first if you're focused on that. This might come first if you focus on that. So, and especially this is more of an asterisk. Inner logic comes when you're older, oftentimes. But you don't need vision to know a language. Okay, so inner, right here, this is figurative. So you don't literally need a voice to know language as well. Or you don't need to hear to know language. So what are you saying? Yeah, but you would need to imagine how it sounds like you wouldn't. To speak, yes, you would need an inner, you would need to hear. It's playing like blind versus deaf, I suppose. So if you're using black and white cases, then blind versus deaf. I mean, I think Indy has a comment on signs of affection. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. So it's all the above, Sweat. It's all the above. I don't want anyone to be blind or deaf. So let's lighten the mood a little, Sweat. I think we're going a little like too extreme where like if you cut off someone's limb, do they like if you cut off someone's arm, do they need the arm to perceive moving an arm, right? That kind of thing. We're going into philosophy now a lot, but I wish for everyone who's born to not be blind or deaf. So let's go back to the idea that it's nice that we have all of these things, and I love it that you have a priority that you know works incredibly for you. Here's one that I like sometimes when I use the other way around, right? For example, and the beginning was thinking more in the line that language exists before written language. Oh, that's a great point. That's a great point. Language exists as sounds, right? Before written. I get what you mean. Fair enough. Yeah. Before written language. Yeah. I agree with you. This is a fact. I feel this is a fact. However, sound didn't exist before vision. At least I don't think. I feel like both vision and sound is debatable which came first. Right? So like pictures. Or like colors. Colors like make you feel things before there were written languages to express it. Right? And I have let's step back even further and just say the whole essence of a human being, right, came before all of this. Before there was language or any form of communication, there was the whole human being. So the senses came about. So the question is now we're asking, which senses came first? Written language came out of spoken language? True. True. I agree with that. Probably. But now we're talking about written languages. But the thing we were talking about was inner voice. Inner voice versus inner vision. When you hear something, you also see something. Like for those who aren't deaf or blind, right? So when a human is born, you both see and hear things. Unless you want to go into the development cycle of a fetus, I don't know enough about fetal development to know if a fetus hears before they see, or they see before they hear. That's not in the, I suppose that's not in the scope of language. But if we're thinking about the scope of language, yeah, I would say it's probably likely that spoken language came before written language, as in written language with abstraction, system, and rules. Is it the same as someone saying, is it the same as someone smiling and not saying anything? Did smiling come before speaking? Did seeing someone who looks like you communicate we're like each other before spoken language was? Well, I can tell you a lot of animals would see each other, and they can see each other that they're different, and they have no form of spoken language that's communicated between them. So you can make a lot of arguments where sound is great, so is vision. Not you're comparing sound, which is the element of hearing, to written language, which is something constructed with inner logic. So the last phase, in my opinion, writing systems require inner logic. Fundamentally, written language was created to represent the spoken language. I understand. Yes, I agree. Leading me to think that spoken language will immensely help with learning. That's a fair point. That's a very fair point. So if you learn the sounds, I agree with you. Actually, that's probably what I would say empirically, Sweat. I lean towards that too. Sound comes, for me, speech and sound comes before writing. When I was younger, writing came before speech. And this is after the writing system already exists. So I wrote before I could hear and have an inner voice. So I saw things before hearing what they sound like as a kid. Now it's this way because I focus on sound and speech now. So Duolingo is doing exactly the opposite. Duolingo is using child development, in my opinion, like old school child development way, where if they focus on sight, like reading and stuff, and focus less on sounds, it goes this way. So yes, I like this way far more. As an adult, I like this way far more. I was taught this way first. And am I a child anymore? I don't know. Like you can only be a child once. So it's funny you say those perspectives, and I do find that the younger you get, especially younger like middle school kids, their writing skills far exceed their speech skills and sound recognition first. And it might be due to the established formal education, like the structure of formal education. Remember, we're not talking about the origins anymore, like whether speech was designed for written or written is designed for speech. Now they both exist when someone is born into the system. So when someone's born into the system, they either pick up writing or speech first. And oftentimes formal education has an enrichment for writing as a kid before speech. So I wrote a lot of things that I didn't know what it sounds like as a kid, especially when I had two languages before. And then, just so you know, Fujonese is entirely speech oriented. So I never developed writing. Writing didn't even came by yet. So I know for a fact that yes, you can acquire the essence of a language without necessarily ever writing. However, in English, my writing came about and it influenced my speech. So because of all the writing, the scientific writing, and all the nuances of specialized English, which involves interpretation between sub-English, my speech benefited from that. How I'm speaking now as a content creator, or I guess I will label myself as a content creator, as someone who have just spent over 2 hours formulating a idea that I only spent 3 hours thinking about yesterday, reading for 3 hours, and how to depict all these things and organize the thoughts. I write before I speak. Nowadays, though, I have chosen to learn most things auditorily. So I have shifted from a more auditory form of learning. So now, when I'm learning Japanese on Duolingo, it's written, literally written most of the time. However, I spend time speaking the stuff to myself and talk to myself and discuss with myself. And then when Duolingo shuts off, I'm listening. I'm listening most of the time. I watch YouTube videos about listening and whatnot. So the answer to that, again, from my perspective, is both. I try to do them simultaneously. They are interlocked. So to maximize and slow down my efficiency, I guess, in speech or writing, I do both. I feel we share a lot of opinions on this. Yes, we probably do, because I think you prioritize very specific things that you maybe advise a lot of people and help a lot of people, hopefully. I feel like you have a very a passion for the learning process, like how you approach learning, right? And maybe it's confined to language, I suppose, because oftentimes you're very specific about saying written language and spoken language. The stuff that I'm talking about doesn't necessarily mean I'm trying to restrict what I'm saying to writing and speaking a language. However, I'm more talking about even a broader sense of acquiring skills. And acquiring skills don't necessarily have... It has a lot of overlaps with writing and speaking. But then we get into forming habits. And forming habits don't necessarily be bound by written language or speaking language. How do you get someone to learn a habit or condition a habit? How do you get someone to ride a bike? Do you speak to them on how to ride a bike? Do you write to them about how to ride a bike? Or do you demonstrate how to ride a bike? Right? Like, there are a lot of other elements, and I'm bringing them to language learning. And I'm not a language learner. So I'm not a professional language learner. I'm not someone who has many years of experience of learning a language. I have anecdotal experiences that would suggest that I can speak something and have no comprehension of writing, and another instance in which I have far more comprehension in writing than in speaking, in speaking or sounding. Much like when going back to the and the ah in America, right? America, that kind of thing. So I imagine your hearing is incredibly much more well developed than mine. Absolutely. But my question is, how is your English writing? There's a forethought. I think your English is pretty excellent when it's written, because it's quite nice to read your English. I'm not entirely sure if it demonstrates the nuance of written English, though, in my opinion. So much like you, my speech acuity and my hearing acuity is probably not that great. Not to your standards, probably. I probably have sacrificed that. You pass with flying colors in high school. Other than that, I do little English nowadays. That's fair. That's fair. What do you usually do? What do you usually use in your environment? I use 2 languages in my environment. When I'm on here, it's English. If I had to be super specific, my writing English is different from my speaking English. Norwegian? Fair enough. Like here, let me read. I want to read something that I write. And I'll let you know if this impacts how. Let me read something, right? For example, my typical writing language is very different from my speaking language, only because I don't use it very often. For example, oh, these are kind of out of context though. I would need to write something. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. No, I don't have anything that I could say without needing context, and it would take quite some time. We'll probably get to it when I learn. When I start reading books. I'll start transcribing things, right? Learn to transcribe things and kind of translate things, but interpret things. So perhaps that will become more evident in the future, I suppose. But my writing English is far more developed than my English speech still to this day, even though I spend quite a lot more time, like literal time, developing communication skills in English. Interesting concept. I think I agree with you for Japanese. Or like right now, I focus far more on sounds and speech. It's actually kind of very refreshing to use that approach for the first time in my life. This is the first time that speech came for, like, focus on sound and speech came first, which is voluntary. The first time I learned a language post adolescence was Spanish. And Spanish, while there was a lot of emphasis on sounds and speech, a lot of the majority proficiency and competency came from writing. Whether that's more efficient or not, or more important or not, it's the order that has been used in the past. So this has already been used. And naturally, my speech was underdeveloped compared to my reading comprehension. So perhaps it doesn't translate as much. Who knows? I will find maybe in the future to see if I entirely focus on sound and pronunciation, would that lead to increased comprehension of another language? So we could switch it up to a entirely isolated language and see if I'm that's such an interesting social experiment on myself. Possibly. My wheels are cranking. I'm thinking about it. I'm visualizing it in my head. I'm visualizing how that workflow looks like. Yeah, I'm visualizing like what the steps are. The steps I would take in like a diagrammic form. So like, laundry list. If it happens this way, laundry list. If it happens this way, laundry list. Right? This is what I see in my head. So I don't know if this is how you see it in your head. Oftentimes when I see a puzzle, I don't necessarily have to hear a puzzle. to solve the puzzle. Sometimes. Okay. That was 2 hours. I love the share. Sweat. Love the share. I think my perspective is all the above. You make some very valid points. Are you thinking on learning a language entirely through sound? I might. That might be interesting. Or maybe like to a limited extent or something. I haven't ever done that. I haven't ever isolated anything. So my approach to learning has largely been all of the above. I haven't done it from a specialized point of view. Just to test some running theories. I know Pimsleur. Oh yeah, Pimsleur, yeah. Did something like that. They had these audio CDs. Okay, we'll save that for now. I have a lot of plans already in motion. However, that's really interesting. Because it's already too late. It's already too late for Japanese. It's already too late for Mandarin. It's already too late for Spanish. The 3 languages I have planned in that order. It's already too late for that because I already had a lot of ear training going into Japanese. Mandarin, ear training and a related language. And then Spanish, I was taught written before speech. So it's very difficult. But maybe finding a little bit more of an extreme case and trying to learn all of it from audio would be very interesting experiment. Have you done it before? What? Where you exclusively did something. And I'm talking about exclusive. For me, it's a pretty much a little bit of everything. Like, or I don't technically prioritize something. I let it happen, I suppose. Whatever becomes natural. So for Japanese, whatever I'm doing now just happened to enrich for sounds, for speech first. So I'm usually talking about process-oriented stuff. And when you're thinking about, prioritizing sound as to versus written, you're talking about the overall endpoints, like which way is more effective in the long run. Which way is more effective over a prolonged period of time. Most of the time I fill it out. I fill out the thing by doing as much as I can and then grooming all the above. So bottom up, I guess. Bottom up approach to learning. As opposed to top down. In the beginning, I combined reading and listening. Okay, I took a fairy tale where I didn't even distinguish the words when listening. Then I listened to the same story over and over again while reading at native speed until I can hear it more clearly. Yeah. Yep. I can understand that approach. What was my Japanese thing? My Japanese, before starting Duolingo, my Japanese was I captured the feelings. I feel Japanese through sound, through listening. Like listening the audio, like the sound patterns in order to capture the feeling. So oftentimes I would watch anime, but not know what the words are per se. I don't actually literally know, right? Be able to translate. But I know what's happening in the show. And oftentimes when a show is in a scene, I would be doing something else. I would be reading something else, but knowing what's happening from the sound. And that's before I started using Duolingo. So oftentimes I tell people I have a lot of ear training. Now what Duolingo doesn't do is it doesn't train the ear, because they use synthetic voices and out of context synthetic voices for that matter. So they remove what I have had as an advantage. And the only way I can integrate this so-called advantage is relying on me speaking it out loud and feeling it out. So in a way, the closest thing I could say in terms of the whole like listening first is that anime, my attention to anime speech patterns and sounds are what I'm using to bring to Duolingo, even though Duolingo does not take advantage of that. It does not. It usually deals with reading exclusively. It doesn't encourage anyone to speak. There is something that takes mic inputs though, however, but that's the case. And because of that, I haven't ever learned written comprehension. So there are no written comprehension. One problem I could see is that the mind just filters out the sound if you are not actively participating. That's why I choose to read along. I agree with you. I didn't say I didn't do that. Sweat. You jump to the conclusion that when I said when I know what is going on, I do this. So instead of hyper-focusing on the context, the axiom is I already know what is going on. So I'm no longer actively. This is passive participation. In the beginning, active participation requires creating this acuity. So I agree with you. It's not a problem because in this state, you know what's going on. You are already competent in it. So that's not the problem of this state. It's the problem if you're not competent in it. So I absolutely agree with you, the difference between active participation and passive participation. That's a great point. It's also another digression. I talked about this in the context of video games, problem solving, critical thinking across maybe 5 or 10 videos already about the difference between intended active participation versus passive participation. I absolutely agree with you. Excellent point. However, the point that you're talking about is the problem of this, which I deliberately and conditionally said when one knows what's happening, then that enabled me to read something else while listening to something else. Not the same idea of developing a filter when you can't comprehend it, right? So that's fair. And it's not great either. It's passive. This is the whole passive thing, passive versus active thing. Generally speaking, the active participation is necessary for truly learning things in general. And I agree with you in that sense for language or sounds or anything. Actually, I would say I am the poster child to encouraging people to actively do most things. Much like I'm actively, with intention, being involved in this discussion. Not prepping and being actively involved in something tends to produce very messy and possibly misleading memories. So sometimes when you get an impression versus understanding what you remembered. So you get an impression of what you remember through passive learning, but you get an understanding of what you're learning through active participation. Excellent. I think we'll leave it off on that. And maybe revisit that along the way. Also, oh, wait. One last point. I got one last point about the reading along thing. And this deals with a lot of people's hobbies about Japanese subtitles. So, when someone says, I watch anime in Japanese with English subtitles, right? I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, pragmatically speaking. This is kind of closer to passive learning because you're listening to something you don't comprehend while reading something you do comprehend, which is active. So you're actively learning more English as opposed to associating. But, there's some merit to passive learning. However, you could listen to anime in Japanese and also have Japanese subtitles, right? Japanese with Japanese subtitles. That can reinforce active learning where they both are concordant with each other. And do I do this? I actually do this. I watch English things with English subtitles all the time because English subtitles deal with writing comprehension. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, it's still sound versus writing, right? I also watch silent films and silent shows. And now you're focusing on vision. And you can add vision with caption. So if you ever read a screenplay, there are ways to see written screenplay while having a silent film. So there are plenty of other ways, and I absolutely agree with you. Active participation. So I would even argue, to elaborate, when someone watches anime in Japanese and they're reading English subtitle, that's more passive than it is active participation in acquiring the language. So sometimes I watch anime in Japanese with Japanese subtitles. Actually, sometimes I watch I'm gonna get roasted for this. I watch English dubs of multicultural things like anime or video games, and I also I read it in that language. So ask yourself if you're still watching Norwegian shows and reading Norwegian language being written. And then ask yourself, are you watching silent Norwegian content versus other silent Norwegian content? And see how the face, the nonverbal communication is different. Because body language is also part of the acting experience. Body language, facial expressions, movements. Like, for example, does anyone know what I'm doing right now? Because this is an obvious motion if you've watched anything from Bollywood. Do you notice this? Do you notice my head tilt every time I'm confirming something? When you're watching someone give a speech in your native language, are you seeing their body language? Do you see how their hands are moving? Their eyes are shifting. That is vision language. And when someone tells me, when I hear a sound, I'm also picturing the mouth. I'm also picturing someone's motion. So it's far more dynamic than that. While someone does focus on sound, for sure. If I see the word, I don't know, in what's a good word, like an onomatopoeia. What are you seeing when you see an onomatopoeia written? And then if you see a ball drop and it's silent, what kind of sound does it make? And if you have a subtitle with a caption, what would it say? Would it say bang, thwack, zoom, boom? What are comic books? What do comic books do for onomatopoeia? Things like that. Totally agree. There are many, many dimensions of language. Another like throw out to the people: computer language, programming language. Ooh-wee. What you see a program do, like what a program does on your screen. Program does on your screen versus what the program language is and how it's written. That's also really fantastic. So when I think of a programming language, right, I visualize what I need it to do. So like I'm picturing a ball rolling across from left to right, and then I deconstruct it and then write it out, right? So there are other dimensions of just visualizing. But at the same time, can you speak the programming language? You can kind of. You can kind of speak the programming language. So lots of other different takes. Not enough time to cover all of it. And definitely, Sweat, feel free to throw in like funny observations and stuff. I absolutely love when people say like, did you find it interesting that this happens when you do this? Do you do this, or do I do this? That's kind of that's so much fun. It will mean that I will learn nothing from Duo because I would be talking about it for days. That's what I'm here for. So I really appreciate your candor, Sweat. I want to emphasize that I really appreciate your candor. I absolutely love this. If it's not so visible on my face, right? Like say you have your audio turned off. If it's not visible, I hope I look visibly happy. A lot of times when I was a kid, I had visual problems too. So my nonverbal communication is not concordant with my speech. So my speech gives off one impression. My visuals give off a different impression. And that's oftentimes in the field of psychology where you have kids that are dissonant with their expression. So they would say, I am happy. Meanwhile, when you look at their face, it doesn't appear like they're communicating visually if they're happy. So oftentimes people would tell me like, why are you so upset? I'm like, no, I'm just thinking. Nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication would be the essence of communicating without a written language, right? So when someone's smiling, you would like to know that that means they're happy. However, if you don't have command of visual language, which is your nonverbal communication, and then you use a frowny face and say, I'm having the best time of my life, that is confusing. So I don't know what it's like when someone says I'm hurt. Like, what is the visual communication of I'm hurt? Some people would say, would be dying inside, and they would be standing stoic, right? So you wouldn't be able to tell if they're hurt because they don't want to express that they're hurt. So it's kind of like the weirdest thing about the cultural differences in their nonverbal communication. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. And what is Rust, by the way? What do you mean by Rust? I'm not actually familiar with Rust if you're saying that in the context of computing language. And I think that's a good place to end for the digression. I love the extra contribution. I don't know if Indy is still here, but usually these bits go for 2 to 3 hours. If someone talks, it goes to 3 hours. Usually I only prep for 2 hours of things. Rust is a programming language. Memory safe and no garbage collector. Interesting. My only experience right now that I've done related to education and something I did professionally, I suppose, or semi-professionally. Python is the first one. I since delved into a little bit of R, which is very specialized, and MATLAB, right? Very specific use cases. And then because of some other people, I wanted to learn with them. So some C++. I don't know if I'm ever going to pursue JavaScript. But that's my background. I would love to go into like other modules, you know, like gaming modules, things like the stuff that are like all the rage right now. But these are the language exposures, so to speak. One friend of mine tried to explain to me how Perl worked, right? Perl. I don't like MATLAB. But it was an extra thing to learn. I don't like MATLAB. But Perl was the other one. Someone tried to explain to me in Perl, and that's what led me to pursuing Python. Because I resonated more with Python than I resonated with Perl. So those are my things. Learn different languages. Hey, Cozy. Okay, so before I hop into lessons, I'm going to take a bathroom break. This is how I end my digressions. Listening. You're awesome. I'll be right back.